Trapped in the snow. In the winter of 1916, not only was the war between Italy and Austria-Hungary raging in the Dolomites, but also a relentless battle against nature. A young Alpini soldier got separated from his patrol in a snowstorm. Within minutes, the world around him was nothing but white, raging chaos. An avalanche swept him away, burying him under snow and ice. When he awoke, he was lying in a cave that the mass had accidentally formed, a prison of cold, but at the same time his only salvation. His supplies were ridiculously meager: a piece of chocolate, hard as stone, and a few crumbs of bread. Day after day he broke off tiny pieces, letting them melt slowly on his tongue, as if he wanted to stretch out time itself. He melted snow in an empty tin can with the faint fire of his breath. To keep himself from going mad, he talked to the walls, hummed old folk songs, and carved small notches into the rock with his pocket knife, each notch proof that he was still alive. The days blurred into one another. Sometimes he heard a dull rumbling above him. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in the wind. His comrades had long since given up the search. They thought he was buried and dead, but his determination to return kept him going. After several weeks, emaciated, his face marked by frost, he dared to break out. With his bare hands and a blunt knife, he dug his way up piece by piece. When a ray of sunlight finally broke through the snow cover, he crawled out into the glaring white. Half dead but alive, he dragged himself back to his own position. There, his comrades' horror soon gave way to incredulous joy. The dead man had returned, a ghost of the mountains that even the mountains themselves had been unable to swallow up. In the cold land. When World War I began in 1914, the British Empire sent over 130,000 Indian soldiers to Europe. Men from Punjab, Rajasthan, and Bengal who had grown up in the heat of India and suddenly found themselves in the freezing winter of France and Belgium. Many of them saw snow for the first time in their lives. They described it in letters home as cold fire falling on their turbans and covering the fields like a shroud. The men initially wore thin uniforms that offered little protection. Soon they were shivering in the trenches, which turned into muddy swamps. They fought not only against German shells, but also against hypothermia, hunger, and homesickness. Their letters, often monitored by British censors, nevertheless tell of a longing for familiar foods, the sound of their native languages, and the confusion of being able to communicate with French civilians and British officers only through gestures. Despite this unfamiliarity, they fought with great bravery. Indian cavalrymen even rode into battle at the Somme until they were mowed down by machine guns. Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus served shoulder to shoulder, a rare mix of faiths that developed an unexpected brotherhood under the conditions of war. Some of their letters also describe encounters with the civilian population, children who were fascinated by their turbans, or French women who secretly gave the exotic soldiers warm milk. Others describe the incomprehensible horror of friends being swallowed up by gas clouds without anyone being able to help. When the war ended, many of them returned broken. In Europe, their story quickly faded. But in the letters that still lie in archives today, the voice of a generation that fought in the distant West and got to know the cold face of war there lives on. Rothers in the rubble, Stalingrad, winter 1942. The city had long since been reduced to a pile of rubble, every street a battlefield. German and Soviet wounded lay in a burned-out house whose walls rose into the sky like broken ribs. Grenades had been hurled into the building. Retreat was impossible, the cold unbearable. None of them had the strength to lift their weapons. At first there was mistrust. Every breath, every groan in the darkness sounded like a threat. But then a strange, silent truce began. One of the Germans, seriously wounded in the leg, pushed his canteen across the floor. It rolled to a Russian who lay feverish and pale. The Russian drank, then nodded weakly. Later he pushed back a piece of hard black bread. Thus a fragile camaraderie developed. They shared the little they had: a bandage made from a torn shirt, a few drops of water, a rusty spoonful of soup that one of them had heated over a burning beam. Language separated them, but gestures were enough. A nod, an outstretched arm, a faint smile were enough to forge a bond that was stronger than the slogans of their armies. Outside, all hell was breaking loose. Gunfire, bombs, screams. Inside, amid the rubble and dust, a fragile calm prevailed. They knew they were enemies, but at that moment they were simply human beings fighting for their bare survival. When Soviet troops finally recaptured the district, the surviving Germans were taken prisoner. A Soviet medic is said to have remarked in amazement, "They lay here together like brothers." Of the men who witnessed this small miracle of humanity, only a few survived the war. But the memory remained. Even in the deepest abyss of war, something else could shine for a short time. Camaraderie, beyond uniforms. A silent rebellion. It was Christmas 1914, and in the trenches of Flanders, an almost unreal calm lay over the battlefield. For months, British, French, and German soldiers had known only the horrors of war, the ground covered in mud, the air filled with gas and smoke. But on this winter evening, something unusual happened. The soldiers began to sing, then they waved to each other across no man's land. And finally, an improvised ball rolled between the trenches. The soldiers laughed, threw gloves and hats to each other, and for a brief moment, the war seemed forgotten. On both sides, men who had been shooting at each other just a few weeks earlier were now playing together. Letters from this period tell of handmade Christmas trees, stars carved from cardboard, and small gifts that were pushed across the battlefield. But the idyll was deceptive. The Army's high command did not tolerate compassion for the enemy. Anyone who took part in the spontaneous celebrations risked severe punishment. One of the British soldiers who had taken part in the soccer game with the Germans was chosen as an example. He was transferred to the front line as punishment to one of the bloodiest battles of the following weeks. There he fell, and many of his comrades later wondered whether a moment of humanity had been worth his death. This episode illustrates the paradoxical nature of war. Even in the deadliest of environments, people found ways to express their humanity, albeit briefly. The Christmas soccer games were not officially recognized. They disappeared from the reports and were forgotten. But this quiet rebellion lives on in the diaries of the survivors, a testament to the fact that even in the midst of battle and death, a spark of hope existed. Night witches. In the winter of 1942, the shadow of death hung over the ruins of Belarus and Ukraine. High in the sky, the planes of the Night Witches took off, a very special bomber squadron of the Soviet Air Force, consisting exclusively of women. In rickety wooden biplanes that creaked silently, they flew into the night. The planes were slow and outdated, with little protection, and yet that was precisely what made them so dangerous. The witches used the silence of the darkness as a weapon. Minutes before reaching their target, they switched off their engines and glided through the cold night like ghosts over the German positions. Below in the ground fire, the soldiers heard only the rustling of the wind and then the dull thuds of bombs that seemed to fall out of nowhere. Many Germans later reported that they never saw the attack coming, only the horror that followed. The women themselves wore turbulence, cold, and hours of surveillance like a second skin. Their uniforms were often soaked with frost, their hands and feet numb, but they returned every time, bringing news, morale, and supplies across the front. Between missions, they wrote little stories in their diaries, the friendship between them, the fear of crashing, the joy when an attack was successful and no comrade was lost. The Night Witches became a myth for their opponents. German soldiers called them ghosts in the night, and the fear they spread was greater than any machine they flew. Their bravery was extraordinary, not only because they survived in wooden planes, but because they became symbolic figures, the indomitable power of will in the midst of war and darkness.